Well, hey guys, thanks so much for joining us. I want to wish each and every one of you a very Merry Christmas. We've asked Jeff Nielson from Bullion Bulls Canada to jump on the line and celebrate a little Merry Christmas with us with a news update as we document the collapse, and for Jeff's perspective on the New World Order and can humanity defeat the Rothschild cartel and their plans to enslave us. Jeff, how are you?
Hanging in there, Sean. It's a crazy world these days, but what can we do other than try to explain it to people as best as we're able?
Well, that's right. And to that end, I want to just document a few news items from just the past couple of days. Number one, we see the ruble in hyperinflation in Belarus. And I just did a little Googling just so everybody knows what Belarus is and where it is located, guys. It is an Eastern European country. It's officially known as the Republic of Belarus, and it's a landlocked country in Eastern Europe, bordered by Russia to the northeast, Ukraine to the south, and Poland to the west. And they are suffering hyperinflation. That's one bit of news I wanted to share. But to flush that out just a little bit further, Jeff, let me ask you this. In your estimation, does something called the New World Order exist? Is there an international banking cartel that is alive and well on planet Earth?
Well, there is undoubtedly an order, capital O, which is governing our societies and controlling our governments. But in no respect at all is it a new world order. It is the old world order, the same old money, the same clans of oligarchs who've been controlling our societies for literally more than 100 years.
Very well put. Okay, now let me ask you this. Let's stay on track here with Belarus hyperinflation of the ruble. Is that old world order firmly in control of the U.S. government at this point in the Federal Reserve?
Puppet is the only relationship that I can think of to describe that connection between the oligarchs and the U.S. government. It's master-servant. They ask, and the U.S. government delivers.
Okay, now third question. Is this old world order via these international banks, this banking tyrannical cartel, are they targeting Russia and the ruble?
Yes, and it's so obvious. I actually was just perusing an article over at Jim Sinclair's site taken from The Sovereign Man, who was engaging in some fundamental currency analysis, comparing the fundamentals backing the ruble to the fundamentals backing the US dollar. And one of the obvious stats that was tossed out there, which of course is of tremendous significance, are the quote unquote capital cushions in the monetary systems of these two economies. The capital cushion for the entire U.S. banking system, and thus the basis for the value of the U.S. dollar, is only 1.2%. Over in Russia, the capital cushion is over 12%. The Russian financial system is literally 10 times better capitalized than the U.S. financial system. And of course, it's not fundamentally bankrupt like the U.S. economy. So on any possible legitimate analysis, it is the U.S. dollar that should be plummeting into a currency crisis, and of course the Russian ruble, which is to be soaring in value, especially with the insane interest rates which the Russian government has been forced to impose to attempt to fight off this economic terrorism.
Okay, that is exactly right. And here's my point, Jeff. If we agree that this old world order, as you call it, I call it the New World Order, does exist, and if we agree that it is firmly in control of the U.S. government, and if we agree that it is targeting Russia and the ruble, then what is to stop this old world order from eventually targeting the United States and the dollar itself when the time to do so suits them? That's the point I wanted to make, because there are so many people, there are so many Americans, and we see them leaving comments at SGT Report and below the interviews on YouTube saying that you guys are wrong, you're nuts, the dollar will never collapse. And my point is, it will collapse when they're ready to make it collapse.
Well, in fact, it's not even a matter of making it collapse. As I've written, for now a couple of years, in fundamental terms, the U.S. dollar is already worthless based on at least 3 different separate objective metrics. There's no possible way that the U.S. dollar can be worth anything at all. So it's not a matter of these oligarchs torpedoing the dollar at some point in the future. Rather, at some point, they will simply no longer be able to prop it up because it is already totally worthless.
Let me ask you this. Now, before we move on to a couple of other headlines, I wanted to ask you this. We just did an interview with Michael Noonan, And I titled that, Can the Rothschild Plan to Enslave Humanity Be Stopped? Michael Noonan believes that the Rothschild system of control is so widespread, so interconnected, and so international in scope that the Rothschilds' plans probably cannot be toppled or stopped. Now, that's not to say that any of us should give up, and that's not to say that I believe that. That was his take. I wanted to ask you for your take, Jeff. Can the Rothschilds, can these international banking mafioso families and their plans to enslave humanity be stopped?
I think in theory, their conspiracies can be stopped, but it would require collective, forceful action, something we have not seen any signs of in the global community to this point. So more than likely, their machinations cannot be stopped. But here we simply have to logically project things. If they get everything they want, what they will do is destroy themselves. This is the inevitable reality of all psychopaths. They take and take and take and cannibalize and bloodsuck. And what happens when they're finished? Nobody has anything but the cannibals and the bloodsuckers themselves, and then they turn on each other. There is no other possible way this can evolve. If they get everything they want, if they stay totally in control, then what will happen is they will destroy themselves. So it's not a question of can the Rothschild's old world order ever be removed from enslaving humanity. The question is whether we will do it of our own volition or whether they will destroy themselves.
All right, very well said. Now, you said that there really hasn't been a worldwide movement that we've seen up to this point, but let me challenge you on that with a couple of bright spots of which I know you're well aware. Number one, we see nation states repatriating, or at least trying to repatriate their gold. We saw Iceland take action against the banksters and jail some of them and immediately turn their economy around within 18 months by rejecting bankster ill-gotten debt. And we see Russia and Putin, in my opinion, standing up to the Rothschild cartel to the degree he in Russia is able. And the last thing is the development of the BRICS Bank, the Shanghai Gold Exchange, the Shanghai Silver Exchange. So many bright spots for humanity if we can just take a look outside of the scope of the mainstream mockingbird media, whose talking points are generally government propaganda that are spewed endlessly at citizens in the United States. What do you make of any of those points I just made there? Aren't those all examples of humanity at various levels standing up against the Rothschilds?
I would say that we're both right, and let me explain how that works. When I said I haven't seen any signs of overt action to stand up to this crime syndicate, I'll stick with that. But I would totally agree with your points that there has been positioning by these various entities in the rest of the world to prepare themselves for making some move. And, I saw a wonderful analogy in another commentary recently talking about chess players. And simply that the East, Russia, China, and some other key states in the rest of the world were better chess players than the psychopaths of this old world order. I found the argument very persuasive, and I found it a great metaphor to view the current paradigm because, of course, the way you win at chess is to position yourself in a superior manner to your opponent, and then once you have that superior position, then you take advantage.
All right. Well, I think that we're on the same page then, and I think that Michael Noonan, who's a man I hold in esteem, and he is a friend of ours, that was one man's take, and it doesn't necessarily mean that Michael Noonan is right. But at SGT Report, we never know what our guests are going to say before they say it, and of course, we air our interviews wherever they may fall. And we'll have Michael on again because Michael has been talking straight and shooting straight about the Rothschilds since the very first time I interviewed him. He's not afraid to name names, and he doesn't mince words. Now, I would like to segue over to the bullion crisis. Your new article, Banksters' Bullion Crisis at a New Extreme. We should talk about that because as we record this interview, Paul Craig Roberts and Dave Kranzler article comes to mind called The Lawless Manipulation of Bullion Markets by Public Authorities. It seems you and Paul Craig Roberts and Dave Kranzler are on the same page. And add to that this little goodie from Andy Hoffman at Miles Franklin. A major silver shortage must and will occur. And let me just read you the first little bit of this, Jeff. Never before has the chasm of destruction between economic reality and manipulated financial markets been this wide, and likely never will it be again. The 853 points of infamy the plunge protection team managed to goose the Dow Jones propaganda average this week amidst not only the most laughable FOMC statement ever, but a slew of ugly economic, monetary, and geopolitical developments was truly a sight to behold. Jeff, what do you make of this endless manipulation? We've talked about it ad nauseum, and it is certainly an important part of documenting the collapse.
Well, and of course, highlighting the Dow Bubble Index is the perfect way of bringing that to readers' attention. Because if you just look at the other economic news that's hit the airwaves, we have this ludicrous announcement of a final GDP reading for the U.S. economy of 5% growth for Q3. And of course, not only do your audience and regular readers of mine, know this is absolute nonsense, but, even people who are tuning in for the very first time can immediately understand that this is a total fabrication and total nonsense by simply looking back 3 weeks in time to the latest Black Friday shopping massacre. As I reported in my own writing, this 2014 Black Friday shopping weekend represented a 20% plunge in sales year over year versus last year, measured in real dollars. That's nothing less than a massacre in a supposed consumer economy. And yet we're told that in the quarter immediately prior to this, the U.S. economy surged upward by more than it has at any time in the last 12 years. So obviously, if consumers were benefiting from this massive surge in GDP growth, spending on the Black Friday weekend would have surged upward as well. And of course, as Zero Hedge points out correctly, this isn't really a actual surge this quarter. It's simply a matter of them concocting the number so that the first quarter was grossly underreported and this quarter was grossly overreported. The total dollars are still the same, but the manner in which they're broken down is just total fraud.
Yeah, well, the whole system is total fraud, and so is the reporting of the GDP and the numbers, including the number of people that are actually unemployed in this country, which we've talked about so often. According to John Williams, that number, the real rate of inflation in this country, is much closer to 20 to 25%, with 23% often being cited as the magic number of real unemployment in the United States. Of course, you won't hear that from CNBC, and you certainly won't hear it from the fascists who are in charge of the U.S. government and the reporting. And in the spirit of talking about endless manipulation, Jeff, let's circle back to that Paul Craig Roberts, Dave Kranzler article, the lawless manipulation of bullion markets by public authorities, by the government, right? By the Federal Reserve. And let's circle back and talk about the banksters' bullion crisis at a new extreme, your article. How do those two articles relate? Because it seems to me you guys are both writing about very similar subjects, and we all know that the bullion manipulation and the precious metals manipulation is as real as the LIBOR manipulation.
And once again, it's a really simple equation. If you suppress the price of anything, you're going to overstimulate consumption and you're going to suppress supply. So, of course, if you suppress the price of something, you create a supply deficit. And we've had long-term price suppression of bullion, so we've had a long-term supply deficit. Well, of course, if you have year after year, decade after decade of supply deficit, eventually you run out of supply. And so, of course, that's where we're at today. The new extreme crisis, less bullion than ever before, more demand than ever before. You put those two parameters together and it can only end in implosion. It's only, once again, a question of how or when they destroy themselves in this market, not if.
Well, when you talk about a shortage of supply, Jeff, can you help quantify that for us? Because you and I both know that if you go to any of the bullion dealers that we recommend, SD Bullion, Miles Franklin, APMEX, Provident, if you go down that list, you will be able to find plenty of supply of silver and gold for your dollars should you want to exchange fiat for precious metal in physical form, which is what we recommend. But what we constantly hear from critics is just that. There's plenty of metal out there. What are you nutbags talking about? But what I always want people to understand, Jeff, is that even though there's 2,000 plus Target stores in this country and there's 4,500 plus Walmart stores, none of those stores carry precious metals. And the names that I just mentioned of the retail bullion dealers, they don't have 2,000 stores across the country. They have one. There's one source. There might be 5 or 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 sources we recommend, but that's a very finite amount of sources should everyone in America wake up and want to buy bullion in physical form tomorrow.
And once again, you've hit the nail on the head. Of course, what we see in our society today is people only holding roughly 1% as much precious metals in aggregate terms as they would normally be holding at any other time in history. So, of course, if demand is only 1% of normal, then saying that there's plenty of supply for that demand isn't saying very much. If you can supply 1% of much of the market as usual and say, oh, there's plenty of supply for that, you haven't said anything at all.
Right, and as I've cited so often in all of my microdocs and many of my interviews since he said it in 2010, of course, as you know, Jeff, Jeffrey Christian of CPM Group is very fond of telling the world that there is, as the market deems it, as Wall Street deems it, 100 times the amount of physical that there is.
There's not that much physical metal out there. There isn't. But in the physical market, as the market uses that term, there is much more metal than that. There's 100 times what there is.
And of course, he's referring to paper precious metals. As the market, as his market, as the criminals on Wall Street define it, there's much more precious metals than there is. In his words, there's 100 times what there is. And I think it's far, far worse than 100 times now, Jeff, because the work that we've seen coming out of Brother John and others have documented the immense amount of paper being thrown at the market, sometimes on a daily basis. And in the case of silver, it has been, in some cases, as much silver in physical form that's mined in a year has been thrown at the market in a day in paper.
And again, it's just, fraud, and more fraud. Of course, if you dilute anything, you can expand the supply. But of course, as a physical commodity, you can't really dilute metal. It's either metal or it's paper. And so what we have is fraud, people selling paper and pretending it's metal, unallocated accounts where, of course, the same metal is pledged to 100 different buyers, which is one way to interpret Jeffrey Christian's huge gaffe that there's 100 times as much paper out there in the gold market, quote unquote, as there is gold. If there's 100 times as much paper, one way to define that is 100 owners for every ounce of gold that actually exists. And this, of course, traces right back to the panic setting in European governments as they now finally begin to realize that all of the gold that they each think they own is at best a small fraction, which they all have to divvy up amongst themselves.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it really ties all back together as we take a look at what's going on in Belarus, the hyperinflation. There are people now with rubles that are essentially becoming worthless, almost on an more and more worthless on a daily basis. And these people are scrambling in any way they can to try to get rid of what are essentially worthless rubles and to turn them into tangible assets, assets with value, physical assets. And I guess the warning bell that we've been trying to ring for so long, Jeff, is to alert our friends, our families, our colleagues here in this country that that day, the day that the Belarusians are suffering through now, is probably coming sooner than you'd think for the average American and potentially for you folks up there in Canada, Jeff.
Oh, certainly. And, I was listening to an interview from Warren Pollock going back several weeks now, and his own reasoning was that everything is being set up to time the next collapse with the U.S. election cycle and the next presidential election. The collapse will, of course, be blamed on the current administration, and then, Tweedledum will ride in the Republicans claiming to be the rescuers who will save us from the crash created by the Democrats, totally reversing the same sham that was pulled 8 years ago when they collapsed the economy just before the Obama regime took over, and they could pretend to be the cavalry coming in to rescue it. So it's so transparent, it's so obvious, it's so contrived, and yet, of course, the U.S. zombie electorate continues to fall for this stupid two-party dictatorship routine year after year, election after election.
Yeah, and I think a great way to sum up this interview and tie this all together, Jeff, is to just touch briefly again on false flags and propaganda, which seems to be the crux of principles under which this government now operates in the United States. It used to be a foundation of constitutional principles built on the Bill of Rights, the rule of law, common law, respect for property. But now it's very different. This is a very different nation than the one the founders envisioned. Thomas Jefferson would roll in his grave if he could see what's going on today. And one of the things I wanted to mention was this other news item that came out. Jeff, do you remember MH17 that was shot down over Ukraine and firmly blamed on Putin?
Who can forget that?
Who can forget? Well, it wasn't long before that another Malaysian airliner went mysteriously missing, and the Mockingbird media followed that story ad nauseum for literally weeks, after week after week after week, for weeks. And that was MH370. There's this bit of news out of the Daily Mail now. A former airline boss is saying that, quote, the U.S. military shot down MH370 near Diego Garcia because they thought it had been hacked and was about to be used in a terror attack, end quote. Is that just the most flabbergasting thing you've heard in a while, Jeff? But not surprising, right? It's flabbergasting because we were all searching near Diego Garcia. There was eyewitnesses of a low-flying Malaysian airliner by Diego Garcia. And now it's looking more and more like another U.S. government cover-up. The real story we'll probably never know.
Well, and of course, it just makes one think back to 9/11. The U.S. Air Force can police the skies, thousands of miles away from the U.S. mainland, but it can't manage to take care of protecting its own skies directly over its largest cities. This is the nonsensical world we're supposed to believe in, where, a handful of quote-unquote crazy terrorists can penetrate right to the heart of the mightiest empire the world can see and deal out this devastating damage, and it couldn't be prevented. And of course, the absurdity here is I just read this wonderful historical re-examination of Pearl Harbor and how the Pearl Harbor false flag event parallels 9/11 in so many key ways.
Well, it's definitely a wag the dog event. If you can cause an event which upsets the people in the quote-unquote homeland, which is that Nazi-esque term they rolled out right after 9/11 with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, if you can rally people around a crisis, you can get people who are otherwise decent, level-headed people to agree to do the most despicable, awful things to other human beings around the planet. In this case, wars in Afghanistan, wars in Iraq, Syria now, and of course all the war drums beating for war in Ukraine, and eventually perhaps with Russia. It's all just so darn sick, and I think at this point in time, as we talk about this right before Christmas and we outline the collapse and we document the collapse and we talk about all of these terrible headlines, we're talking to people who are like-minded like you and me, people who care about liberty, people who care about uncovering truth, and people who ultimately care about justice. And I think if we're going to beat the Rothschilds, Jeff, that's our best chance, is for people who are like-minded with hearts and souls and wisdom and empathy to wake up to what's going on and to wake up to the propaganda that's being used against us in this country and to wake up and to find a way to find our voices and to stand up against tyranny and to stand up against this new old world order and take our nations back.
But sadly, we're rapidly running out of time. It was only a couple of months ago that the Prime Minister of the UK stood in front of the United Nations and declared in unequivocal terms that people like ourselves, truth seekers who are asking tough questions of our governments and demanding accountability, are literally, quote unquote, terrorists. Truth seekers are terrorists in the mind of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and now in official testimony to the United Nations. Truth seekers equal terrorists. And of course, terrorists have no rights. Terrorists are less than human beings in our fascist system. So, of course, if everybody who disagrees with our government is now a terrorist, they can all be locked up in the gulags.
Well, we'd like to see them try, and the reason I say that, Jeff, is because there's a lot more of us than there are of them. And I think that is what has them petrified at this point. The clip you're referring to, I just watched again recently because we sticky posted Ken O'Keefe's latest video about 9/11. And he calls it a litmus test. And he couldn't be more right. And of course, Cameron in that clip talks about those who would question 7/7, the 7/7 bombings, which we know were false flags. If you don't believe me, check out YouTube and Google Peter Powers admits that they were running the same exact drill on 7/7, and the drill went live.
And the most peculiar thing was we based our scenario on the simultaneous attacks on the underground and mainline station. So we had to suddenly switch an exercise from fictional to real. And one of the first things is, get that bureau number. When you have a list of people missing, tell them. And so it took a long time.
Just to get this right, you were actually working today on an exercise that envisioned virtually this scenario.
Almost precisely. I was up until 2 o'clock this morning because it's our job, my own company, Advisor Consultants. We specialise in helping people to get their crisis management response. How do you jump from slow time thinking to quick time doing? And we chose a scenario with their assistance which is based on a terrorist attack because they're very close to a property occupied by Jewish businessmen. They're in the city, and there are more American banks in the city than there are in the whole of New York. A logical thing to do. And I've still got the...
I was going to say, how extraordinary today must feel for you as it unfolds.
It's on the record, and statistically that is impossible if it weren't a false flag operation. Now, number 2, 9/11. Ken O'Keefe is absolutely right. It is, it was, and it shall be always known to those who are aware and awake a false flag operation. And I'll tell you what, Jeff, what the mainstream media has tried to do with their friends at the CIA is label anyone who is a conspiracy theorist as a nut. They rolled that plan out after the JFK assassination to get people to stop questioning the Warren Commission's report about a magic bullet. It doesn't work. It does not work. People are waking up and people are asking questions, because if you look at a lot of these events with common sense, you realize that common sense dictates that most of these official stories are fables.
Well, and of course, one of the best ways of identifying false flag events is to sit back and think hard and carefully on who benefits from the supposed crime, terrorist event being reported. And if we look back on who has benefited from all the quote-unquote terrorism over the past 10 years or so, it is our fascist governments. It was the excuse for them to rape our constitutions, to turn our societies into fascist police states. They were the only people who have benefited from this terrorism, ergo, they are by far the most obvious suspects as being responsible for all of it.
That's right. And as it pertains to 9/11, I've heard them say conspiracy theorists often seek to find complex reasoning for events, when oftentimes the answer is so simple. And they do this because the world's a complex place, and conspiracy theorists need to find complex ways of defining the world. Well, let me tell you what a bunch of BS that is. I would be much more comfortable with the official story of 9/11, that we were hit and hit hard by 19 hijackers with box cutters under the direction of one man in a cave. That's a much more palatable explanation for what happened that day than the one that we've found to be true, Jeff, which is our tyrannical governments, or at least secret sects within those governments, in cooperation with the intelligence agencies, pull off these events and pulled off 9/11 for their own ends. It's very Machiavellian, right, Jeff? They're more than happy to kill 2,000 people if in their minds they're getting the means to the ends that they want. At the end of the day, the official stories are always more palatable than the false flag truths that we uncover, because the false flag truths are like finding out your father's a serial murderer. Who wants to wake up in a country and realize that their government has been overtaken by a bunch of fascist Nazis, Jeff? But I think that's what we're facing.
Well, and the point here in even more general terms is that the entire phrase conspiracy theory has become obsolete. We no longer live in a world of conspiracy theories. We live in a world of conspiracy facts. Monstrous conspiracies that have been totally exposed again and again. The $500 trillion LIBOR conspiracy, the conspiracy to rig the gold fix, the conspiracy to rig the silver fix, the conspiracy to rig currencies. Again and again and again, we see conspiracy fact totally exposed. So, of course, how can you talk about theories when you already have unequivocal evidence of conspiracy fact? You know, I wrote a commentary entitled "The Non-Conspiracy Nuts," because if you don't believe in conspiracies when conspiracies are already established facts, you're simply an ostrich sticking your head in the sand. It's nonsensical.
Yeah, that's right. Well, Jeff, the bottom line here for our audience is that we really appreciate being a part of a community that is awake, aware, and courageous enough to want to take on the Rothschild banking cartel, courageous enough to want to take on friends and family and colleagues who, for lack of a better word, are sheeple and want to demonize those of us who have the courage to speak out. Because there are many people who are more than happy to embrace complacency, more than happy to embrace their normalcy bias, and are absolutely petrified of seeking truth. I feel very grateful as we move into Christmas here to be a part of a community of so many caring, empathy-filled individuals who just want the best for humanity.
Well, and your reference here to community is so important because it is absolutely imperative at this time more than any other that we create communities and maintain communities. And of course, what we see are the oligarchs doing everything possible to destroy our communities, because if we have communities, we can unite and act collectively. And if our communities are destroyed and we're all nothing but a bunch of isolated, frightened zombies, then divided we fall. So this is the whole point. Communities are so important. It's absolutely imperative that your listeners continue to tune in and talk about what we're saying and doing, and that we continue to make our own efforts, because if we give up our communities, we give up our hope.
That's right. And one last word about Christmas. I wish a very Merry Christmas to everyone listening, and even to those who are listening who are atheists or agnostics. That's absolutely fine. I wish you a Merry Christmas as well, because the bottom line, my research has led me to understand that we are in a spiritual war. This is spiritual warfare, and the people that would carry out false flag terror on behalf of the new old world order, on behalf of a one world government, on behalf of the Rothschild banking cartel and the old world monarchies and the royal bloodlines. I just want to leave folks with this, Ephesians 6:12, as we move towards Christmas. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And I think that sums it up for me, Jeff, because there's a lot of spiritual wickedness in high places within our government, your government, and a lot of these governments around the world.
And once again, I agree entirely with that perspective. What do we see with this politically correct nonsense of saying happy holiday to everyone and sterilizing Christmas? We see them removing the spirituality, the goodwill that brought us together. You know, Christmas is one of the few unequivocally good aspects to Christianity where nobody can protest. It's people being good to other people, something which we've tend to forget about in our day-to-day lives. We need this spirituality. It's not about religion. It's about people coming together. And of course, spirituality is one of the ways in which we can tighten those bonds.
Amen, Jeff. Amen. And as I've always said to folks who care to listen, say what you want about Christianity, but if the world were to embrace and follow the Ten Commandments, we'd live in an Eden. Our guest has been Jeff Nielson, a good friend of ours who we've known for a very long time, one of the first people we've ever interviewed, and his site is bullionbullscanada.com. Jeff, Merry Christmas.
And Merry Christmas to you and your family and everyone in your audience and my own audience. And here's hoping that you all have a safe, healthy, happy holiday and a great 2015.
Yeah, I ditto that. And my thanks and Merry Christmas to my good friends Rory and Peter, who help keep SGT Report robust and vibrant and up to date on a daily basis. Between the three of us, we do our level best to uncover truth wherever we find it. And I want to thank each and every one of you for checking out sgtreport.com and thelibertymill.com for supporting us and for supporting truth.
Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Jeff.
Take care.
Merry Christmas, guys.